A rancher wagered his best bull for a woman's freedom, and won both back home by dusk. The bull's name was Cutter, and I want you to understand what that meant before anything else gets said. Cutter was 4 years old, 1,700 pounds of red roan muscle, descended from a Texas line my father had spent 11 years cultivating before he died. That bull had sired 23 calves in 2 seasons. Every one of them came out thick-necked and deep-chested, and worth twice what a man could get for ordinary stock. A rancher from Laramie had offered me $300 for Cutter in the spring, and I'd laughed at him the way a man laughs when an offer is so far from the truth it becomes a kind of joke. I told him Cutter wasn't for sale at any price, and I meant it. My father's work lived in that animal. The future of the Haverford spread walked around on 4 hooves inside the south pasture fence, and his name was Cutter. I wagered him on a card game I wasn't sure I could win, for a woman whose name I barely knew. That's the plain fact of it, and I've turned it over enough times in the years since that I don't need to dress it up or defend it. You either understand why a man does something like that, or you don't, and explaining it further won't help either way. It was a Thursday in late August, dry as chalk, the kind of day where the dust doesn't settle, it just moves from one place to another. I'd come into Redfield to pick up a load of fencing wire and to settle an account at Harmon's Hardware. The wagon was outside. I had what I needed, and I was loading up when I heard the argument coming from across the street, out front of Delacroix's place. Delacroix ran the general store, and also, unofficially in the back room, at a table that was never quite clean, a lending operation. He wasn't much for interest rates or paperwork. He had his own way of calculating what a man owed and what a woman owed, and the two calculations rarely ran the same. The woman's name was Noel Faber. I knew her only as the widow who'd come down from Colorado Territory 8 months prior with a daughter and a horse, and not much else. She'd been teaching school 3 days a week and doing mending work the other days, and somewhere in the winter she'd borrowed $40 from Delacroix to get through to spring. It's a thing that happens. It's a thing that happens more than people say it does. What she owed now, according to Delacroix, standing wide and loud in front of his store, was not $40. He had a way of explaining the arithmetic that made it come out to 110. And since she didn't have 110 or anything close to it, he had a proposal. She would come to work for him. Not the store. The other work. He had a specific place in mind. A specific arrangement. And he described it in terms just vague enough to be legal and just clear enough to be unmistakable. She didn't flinch, I'll say that first. She stood in the street with her chin level and her hands at her sides, and she told him what he could do with his proposal in a voice so calm, and even that it sounded more frightening than anger would have. She said she had until sunset to produce the money, or she'd see him before the circuit judge. She said she had witnesses to the original agreement. Delacroix smiled the way small men smile when they've already decided the answer and just want to watch you run out the options. He said he'd be happy to wait. She turned and walked away. She didn't run. She walked, her back straight, the way a woman walks when she needs the person watching to believe she has somewhere to go. I don't know why I was still standing there. The wire was loaded. My business was finished. The most honest accounting I can give is that I stood there because something in the way she walked made it impossible to move. Not beauty, exactly. Something more specific than that. Determination on the edge of breaking. The particular posture of a person who has decided they will not let anyone see them break. I followed her. She went to the livery first, then to the assay office, then to a widow named Compton who'd been known to loan small amounts to people in trouble. I kept enough distance that she didn't notice me, and I kept moving when she moved, and I watched every door shut in her face. The widow Compton was the hardest one. She was sympathetic. She said so. She said it twice. Then she shut the door anyway. Noel Faber stood in front of that door for a moment, and then she squared her shoulders and turned around. and I happened to be standing 20 yards behind her on the boardwalk, and there was no pretending I hadn't been following her. She looked at me with the kind of look that tells you exactly who a person is. Not frightened, not angry, measuring. She said, "You've been behind me since Delacroix's." I said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" I thought about how to answer that. I've thought about it since, and I think what I said was as honest as I could manage. I said I wasn't sure yet. She studied me for another moment. She had dark eyes, tired at the edges, and she had the kind of face that's been outdoors enough to lose any pretense of softness. Not hard. Weathered the way honest people get weathered. The way work gets to you over time and leaves its mark without ruining anything. She said, "I have until sunset." I said, "I know." She said, "I won't take charity." I said, "That's not what I'm offering." That wasn't exactly true yet because I hadn't figured out what I was offering. But it became true in the next 10 minutes, while we stood there on the boardwalk in the August heat, and I thought it through the way I think through most things, quietly, with all the pieces laid out, looking for what fits. Delacroix played cards. Not well, but regularly. He played in the back of the Silver River Saloon every Thursday afternoon when business was slow, which it always was on Thursdays. He played against the same 3 men. A freighter named Coyle who drank too much, a surveyor named Platt who was methodical but predictable, and a sheep rancher named Birch who was good enough to beat the other 2 but not good enough to know it. I had played against all of them, not often. I wasn't much for cards as a regular thing, but when I played I was patient, and patience in a card game is worth more than most people understand. The men who lose are usually the men who need to win any given hand. I've never needed to win any given hand. I can let 20 hands go if the 21st is the one that counts. I thought about this for those 10 minutes, and I thought about Cutter, and I added up what I knew, and then I told Noel Faber what I intended to do. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that a rider went past and the dust from his horse settled on both of us before she spoke. She said, "You'd wager your bull on a card game against Delacroix." I said, "Yes." She said, "And if you win, he cancels the debt and I'm clear." I said, "That's the proposal I'll put to him. He'll take it. He's greedy and he thinks he's better at cards than he is." She said, "And if you lose?" I said, "I won't." She said, "That's not an answer." I said, "No, but it's what I've got." She looked at me the way she'd looked at me before, that same long measuring. I didn't look away. There wasn't much to hide. A man who's made his decision has already settled the argument with himself. There's nothing left to be nervous about. She said, "Why would you do that?" I thought about it. I said, "Because he's wrong and you're right, and because I have the means to fix it and I'm standing here instead of somewhere else, and that seems like reason enough." She said, "You don't know me." I said, "No." She didn't say anything after that for a moment. Then she said, "My daughter's at the schoolhouse. I need to go get her before the other children leave." I said I'd come back to her before sunset with an answer. She nodded once, the way a person nods when they've decided to trust something they can't fully account for, and she walked away. I crossed the street to Delacroix's store. He was at the counter, moving a bolt of calico from one end to the other for no reason I could identify. He was a heavy man, pink-faced, with small eyes that were always doing arithmetic. When I walked in, the arithmetic started on me. I told him what I wanted. I put it plain. He had a claim against Noel Faber. I was proposing to settle it in a card game, the 2 of us, best of 5 hands, his claim against my bull. He could look at Cutter before we played, confirm the value. I'd have him delivered to Delacroix's pasture by morning if Delacroix won. If I won, the claim was discharged in full, documented and signed. He was quiet for a moment. I could see him working through it. He knew who Cutter was. Most of the county knew who Cutter was. $300 was what the Laramie man had offered. Delacroix's arithmetic would put it higher. Against a claim he probably couldn't have enforced in front of a judge anyway. Against a woman who'd already said she'd go to the circuit court. The risk to him was small. The upside was Cutter. He said, "You sweet on this woman." I said, "I've spoken to her twice in my life. You want the proposition or not?" He wanted it. I knew he would. I'd known it before I walked in. We agreed on 6 o'clock, the back room of the Silver River, Coyle and Platt and Birch as witnesses to keep it honest. He'd bring the documentation on the claim. I'd bring the bill of sale for Cutter in case I lost. I went back to my wagon, untied the team, and drove out to the south pasture. Cutter was at the fence when I pulled up, the way he usually was late in the afternoon. He was a vain animal in the way that good bulls sometimes are. He knew what he was worth. You could see it in the way he stood. Broad in the chest, head up, watching me come across the grass with an expression that wasn't curiosity so much as assessment, deciding whether I was worth his attention. I stood at the fence for a while. I'd worked this land since I was 9 years old, first with my father and then alone, and Cutter was the best thing on it. The best thing my father had built, passed to me the year he died, and I'd continued the work. There was a specific feeling to standing at that fence that I don't know how to put into plain words, the feeling of something mattering, of a life's work being concrete and real, and standing in front of you in the August light. I scratched him behind the ear, which he tolerated without enthusiasm, and I told him we were going to a card game. He was not impressed. I went back to town. The Silver River smelled the way it always did, sawdust and whiskey and lamp oil, and the particular sourness of men who'd been in from the range. Coyle was already there with a bottle. Platt arrived shortly after, with his surveyor's precision in everything including punctuality. Birch came in last, talking to someone outside before he let the door shut. Delacroix arrived at 6 on the dot with a folded paper in his breast pocket that I assumed was the debt documentation. He sat across from me without much preamble. Coyle dealt. Here is what I will tell you about those 5 hands, because the specifics matter less than people think. I lost the first one. Not badly, but cleanly. Delacroix had good cards and played them with the confidence of a man who thought he already knew the end of the story. The second hand I won. Not dramatically. I let him think I was bluffing when I wasn't, which is the simplest trick there is, and he took the bait because he wanted to. Third hand, he won again. He sat back after that and crossed his arms and smiled at Coyle. I didn't react. I've found that stillness bothers people more than any other response. A man who doesn't react to losing is a man who either doesn't care or doesn't think he's lost, and neither of those is comfortable to sit across from. Fourth hand, mine. He didn't see it coming because I'd spent 3 hands teaching him a wrong lesson about how I bet when I'm strong. He discarded twice trying to read me and ended up with nothing. 1 hand apiece to settle it. Coyle shuffled, Platt cut, the cards went out. I'll say this about the 5th hand. I won it with a pair of 7s, which is about as undramatic as a winning hand gets. But Delacroix had less, and that was the only arithmetic that mattered. He was quiet for a moment. Then he took the paper from his breast pocket and set it on the table and pushed it across to me. The debt was noted in his own hand, $40 principal, various additions that didn't survive scrutiny, the inflated total. Below it was space for a cancellation signature. He signed it while I watched, and Coyle and Platt and Birch witnessed it, and I folded the paper and put it in my coat pocket. I didn't say anything to Delacroix. There wasn't anything to say. He'd made a calculation and lost, the same as any man at a table. I stood up, nodded at the witnesses, and walked out into the evening. The light had gone orange by then, that particular August orange that happens in the last 40 minutes before the sun touches the ridgeline. The dust was still in the air, but it had turned to something closer to amber in that light, and the street was quieter than it had been, most of the day's business settled, and the evening not yet started. I found her at the edge of town, near the road south, standing with her daughter beside the horse she'd come in on. The girl was maybe 8, holding her mother's hand and looking at me with the frank appraisal that children do when they haven't yet learned to pretend they're not looking. I walked up and held out the paper. Noel took it. She unfolded it and read it in the remaining light slowly, every word, the way a person reads something when they need to be sure it's real. Her daughter leaned in and looked at it too, though I don't think she could read it. When she looked up, her expression was, I don't have a precise word for it. Not relief, exactly. Something more complicated. The look of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just set it down but hasn't fully registered yet that their hands are empty. She said, "You won." I said, "Yes." She said, "Cutter's all right." I said, "He's fine. He was not interested in the proceedings." She almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost. She folded the paper carefully and put it inside her coat, the way you handle something that has to stay dry and whole. She was quiet for a moment, and her daughter looked between us, and the light kept going that particular August orange. She said, "I don't know how to thank you for this." I said there wasn't any need. She said, "There is. Don't tell me there isn't." I said, "All right." She looked at me for a long moment, not measuring this time, something different. I'd been measured already. This was something after the measuring, when a person has decided what the measurement means. She said, "Come to supper. Tomorrow. I can't repay you, but I can feed you and I make a decent meal." I said I'd come. She nodded. Then, the way she had twice before, she turned and walked away, but this time it was different. The back was still straight. The chin was still level, but the weight was different. I could see it even from behind, even in the fading light. The particular walk of a person who is going somewhere rather than away from something. The girl looked back at me once before they turned the corner. I stood there a moment longer than I needed to. Then I went back for my wagon and my wire and drove home in the dark, the team knowing the road well enough that I didn't have to guide them much. Cutter was in the south pasture when I pulled past. I could hear him more than see him, the slow movement in the grass, the particular sound a big animal makes when it's settled and content and undisturbed. I unhitched the team and got them watered and went inside and sat in the chair by the window with a glass of water and didn't light the lamp for a while. Just sat. My father used to say that the difference between a man and a coward wasn't whether the man was scared. He said every man with good sense was scared of something. The difference was whether a man could do the thing while scared, and then come home afterward and be quiet about it. I didn't know what I'd started exactly. I knew it was something. You don't wager your best bull for a woman you've spoken to twice and come home feeling nothing. Or if you do, you're a simpler man than I am. But I was home. Cutter was in the south pasture. The paper was in my pocket, signed and witnessed and legal. The work was done. I sat in the dark and drank my water and let that be enough. She fed me supper the next evening. The house she was renting was 2 rooms, spare and clean in the way that tells you a person has chosen carefully what to keep. The table had a cloth on it. The girl, her name was Ida, sat across from me and asked me questions about the bull for most of the meal with a persistence I found genuinely impressive. And Noel kept saying her name in a particular tone, and Ida kept going. The food was good, not fancy. A stew with something in it I couldn't identify but liked, cornbread, coffee, that was stronger than necessary and therefore perfect. After the meal, Ida was sent to bed with a firmness that indicated it was not a negotiation, and Noel and I sat at the cleared table with the last of the coffee. She said, "I want to ask you something." I said to go ahead. She said, "When I asked you why you did it, you said because he was wrong and you had the means to fix it. That was part of the answer." I said, "Yes." She said, "What was the other part?" I turned the coffee cup in my hands. It had a chip on the rim, small on the left side if you held the handle straight. I remember that. I remember most of the specific things about that table, that room, that particular evening. The way the lamp threw shadows, the sound the stew pot made as it cooled on the stove, the thread count of the cloth under my hands. I said, the other part was that you walked away with your back straight when you had every reason not to. And I thought a woman who does that deserves to keep walking that way. She looked at me across the table. It was a straightforward look, not complicated by anything. Just a woman looking at a man and deciding what she thought about what he'd said. She said, "That's a good answer." I said it was the only one I had. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, not dramatically, no particular ceremony. Just a hand over a hand, warm, deliberate, the most straightforward thing in the world. She looked at me while she did it, and I looked back, and there it was. A good woman deciding without apology that she saw something worth seeing. I turned my hand over under hers. We sat like that for a while, listening to the stove cool and the wind outside and Ida's breathing from the other room, even and deep already, the way children sleep when they feel safe. I didn't say much. Neither did she. There are things that don't need to be said, particularly things that have already been established by the fact that you're sitting at a table at all. I left when the lamp was low, and I walked back to my wagon in the dark, and I drove home. Cutter was at the fence again when I came past the south pasture. I don't know what draws him there in the evenings, whether it's habit or temperament or something about the air coming down off the ridge. He stood in the darkness watching me pass with that same expression, assessing, vaguely tolerant, measuring the world against some internal standard. I told him he'd nearly been someone else's problem. He was, as I say, unimpressed. That was the beginning of it, the real beginning, though the wager was where it started. Noel and I took 3 more months to say directly what had already been established, and in that time I came to supper most Sundays, and Ida decided she had strong opinions about cattle and shared them regularly, and the arrangement grew the way arrangements grow when 2 people have already decided the fundamental question and are just letting the details settle at their own speed. When I asked her eventually, it wasn't elaborate. We were at the south fence, the 3 of us, a Sunday afternoon in November, Cutter standing nearby with his usual assessment of proceedings. I asked her if she'd come to the Haverford place, her and Ida both, for good. She said, "I thought you'd already decided that." I said I had, but you get to decide too. She looked at me for a moment. Then at the pasture, the fence, the cold November light across the grass, then back at me. She said, "Yes." Ida said, "Can I name one of the calves?" Noel said her name in that particular tone. Ida held her ground. She has her mother's posture that way, chin level, back straight, not interested in negotiating the things she's already settled. She got to name the calf. I'm not a man given to declaring himself. Never have been. What I know is this. A man can go a long time being good at his work and being useful to the land and being present every day without anyone seeing the whole of it. Not from bitterness on their part. Just from the ordinary difficulty of seeing, which is one of the harder things in the world to do well. Noel sees it. She has from the beginning, from that boardwalk in August, when she turned around and found me there and took my measure with those dark, tired eyes and decided what I was worth. A good woman freely deciding that is worth more than I know how to say. Cutter's at the fence. The light's going orange again. That's enough.